Today we are going to look at slavery throughout history. Today over 40 million people are estimated to live in slavery. 10 million children, 25 million people in forced labor, over 15 million in forced marriage, and approximately 5 million women and girls in forced sexual exploitation. No part of human civilization or period of human history is not characterized by slavery, administered through force, deception, coercion, and often the rule of law. Despite the common misconception that slavery is merely a problem of overseas developing countries, in the U.S. alone every year $150 billion in illegal profits are generated by private economy forced labor. So deeply is slavery entrenched in society that we are unable to reasonably list even all currently practiced slavery in this episode. But slavery is about real people, not lists. For example, Minnie Davis, age 78, interviewed in Athens, Georgia in the 1930s. The Crawford children were caught teaching my mother to read and write, but they were made to stop. Mother was quick to learn and she never gave up. She would steal the newspapers and read about the war, and she kept the other slaves posted as to how the war was progressing. She knew when the war was over almost as soon as Massa John did. I don't recall any certain reason why the slaves were punished. They needed it, I'm sure of that. Some folks need to be punished now. Miss Sue, as we called her, whipped the slaves for misbehavior. I remember one time there was quite a commotion. The town marshal came to our house to whip my mother. It had been told that she had been writing letters, asking people to buy whiskey from her, but Massa John wouldn't let the marshal touch her. There was a jail, but I don't recall that any of Massa John's slaves were ever put in there. I was told that his slaves were, as a rule, well behaved and that they gave him no trouble. We all went to church and Sunday school at the First Presbyterian Church, where the slaves were allowed to sit in the gallery. I recall that Dr. Hoyt used to pray that the Lord would drive the Yankees back. My mother said that all the time he was praying out loud like that, she was praying to herself, "Oh, Lord, please send the Yankees on and let them set us free." How did this come about? Can anything be done? Rare in hunter-gatherer populations, the viability of mass slavery requires economic surplus and high population density. Such conditions came about roughly 11,000 years ago due to the Neolithic agricultural revolution, continuing to this day, give or take the occasional famine. In Senegambia, between 1300 and 1900, close to one-third of the population was enslaved. In early Islamic states of the western Sudan, including Ghana, Mali, Segu, and Songhai, about a third of the population was enslaved. In Sierra Leone in the 19th century, about half the population consisted of slaves. Zanzibar was once East Africa's main slave trading port, and under Omani Arabs in the 19th century, as many as 50,000 slaves were passing through the city each year. Prior to the 16th century, the bulk of slaves exported from Africa were shipped from East Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. Zanzibar became a leading port in this trade. Arab slave traders differed from European ones in that they would often conduct raiding expeditions themselves, sometimes penetrating deep into the continent. They also differed in that their market greatly preferred the purchase of female slaves over male ones. David Livingstone, while traveling in the African Great Lakes region in 1866, described a trail of slaves as such. 19th June, 1866. We passed a woman tied by the neck to a tree and dead. The people of the country explained that she had been unable to keep up with the other slaves in a gang, and her master had determined that she should not become anyone's property if she recovered. 26th June. We passed a slave woman shot or stabbed through the body and lying on the path. A group of men stood about 100 yards off to one side, and another of the women on the other side looking on. They said an Arab who passed early that morning had done it in anger at losing the price he had given for her, because she was unable to walk any longer. 27th June, 1866. Today we came upon a man dead from starvation, as he was very thin. One of our men wandered and found many slaves with slave sticks on, abandoned by their masters from want of food. they were too weak to be able to speak or say where they had come from. Some were quite young. African states played a role in the slave trade, and slavery was a common practice among sub-Saharan Africans before the involvement of the Arabs, Berbers, and Europeans. There were three types: those who were slaves through conquest, slaves due to unpaid debts, or those whose parents gave them as slaves to tribal chiefs. Chieftains would barter their slaves to Arab, Berber, Ottoman, or European buyers for rum, spices, cloth, or other goods. Selling captives or prisoners was commonly practiced among Africans, Turks, Berbers, and Arabs during that era. However, as the Atlantic slave trade increased its demand, local systems which primarily serviced indentured servitude expanded. European slave trading, as a result, was the most pivotal change in the social, economic, cultural, spiritual, religious, political dynamics of the concept of slave trading. It ultimately undermined local economies and political stability, as villages' vital labor forces were shipped overseas as slave raids and civil wars became commonplace. Crimes which were previously punishable by some other means became punishable by enslavement. British explorer Mungo Park encountered a group of slaves when traveling through Mandinka country. They were all very inquisitive, but they viewed me at first with looks of horror and repeatedly asked me if my countrymen were cannibals. They were very desirous to know what became of the slaves after they had crossed the salt water. I told them that they were employed in cultivating the land, but they would not believe me. A deeply rooted idea that the whites purchased Negroes for the purpose of devouring them, or of selling them to others that they may be devoured hereafter, naturally makes the slaves contemplate a journey toward the coast with great terror, insomuch that the Slatees are forced to keep them constantly in irons, and watch them very closely to prevent their escape. During the period from the late 19th century and early 20th century, demand for the labor-intensive harvesting of rubber drove frontier expansion and forced labor. The personal monarchy of Belgian King Leopold II in the Congo Free State saw mass killings and slavery to extract rubber. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the most common forms of slavery were those of prisoners of war and debtors. People unable to pay back debts could be sentenced to work as slaves to the persons owed until the debts were worked off. Warfare was important to Maya society because raids on surrounding areas provided the victims required for human sacrifice, as well as slaves for the construction of temples. Most victims of human sacrifice were prisoners of war or slaves. Slavery was not usually hereditary. Children of slaves were born free. Although slavery was common in pre-Columbian societies and tribes, European colonialism really changed the game. For example, slavery was a mainstay of the Brazilian colonial economy, especially in mining and sugarcane production. 35.3% of all slaves involved in the Atlantic slave trade went to Brazil. 4 million slaves were obtained by Brazil, 1.5 million more than any other country. In the Americas, the shift from indentured servants to African slaves was prompted by a dwindling class of former servants who had worked through the terms of their indentures and thus became competitors to their former masters. These newly freed servants were rarely able to support themselves comfortably, and the tobacco industry was increasingly dominated by large planters. This caused domestic unrest, culminating in Bacon's Rebellion. Eventually, chattel slavery became the norm in regions dominated by plantations. The slave population in the United States stood at 4 million. 95% of blacks lived in the South, comprising 1/3 of the population there, as opposed to 1% of the population in the North. The central issue in politics in the 1850s involved the extension of slavery into the Western territories, which settlers from the northern states opposed. Around the year 1500, slavery had virtually died out in Western Europe, but was a normal phenomenon practically everywhere else. The European imperial powers built worldwide empires based primarily on plantation agriculture using slaves imported from Africa. However, the powers took care to minimize the presence of slavery in their homelands. In 1807, Britain, and soon after the United States also, both criminalized the international slave trade. The Royal Navy was increasingly effective in intercepting slave ships, freeing the captives and taking the crew for trial in courts. Occasionally, attempts to abolish or curtail slavery arise, with varying degrees of success. Although there were numerous slave revolts in the Caribbean, the only successful uprising came in the French colony of Haiti in the 1790s, when the slaves rose up, killed the mulattoes and whites, and established the independent Republic of Haiti. Europe recoiled in horror. The continuing profitability of slave-based plantations and the threats of race war slowed the development of abolition movements during the first half of the 19th century. These movements were strongest in Britain and after 1840 in the United States. In both instances, they were based on evangelical religious enthusiasm that said that owning a slave was a sin and stressed the horrible impact on the slaves themselves. The northern states of the United States abolished slavery, partly in response to the Declaration of Independence between 1777 and 1804. Britain ended slavery in its empire in the 1830s. However, the plantation economies in the southern United States, based on cotton, and those in Brazil and Cuba, based on sugar, expanded and grew even more profitable. The bloody American Civil War ended slavery in the United States in 1865. The system ended in Cuba and Brazil in the 1880s because it was no longer profitable for the owners. Slavery continued to exist in Africa, where Arab slave traders raided black areas for new captives to be sold in the system. European colonial rule and diplomatic pressure slowly put an end to the trade and eventually to the practice of slavery itself. These were neither the first nor the only attempts at slavery abolition in human history. For example, Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, temporarily prohibited the systematic enslavement of conquered non-combatant populations. Cyrus also freed slaves and allowed all deported slaves who had been enslaved by preceding Assyrian and Babylonian kings to return home. Bernard Lewis writes, "In one of the sad paradoxes of human history, it was the humanitarian reforms brought about by Islam that resulted in a vast development of the slave trade inside and still more outside the Islamic Empire." He notes that the Islamic injunctions against the enslavement of Muslims led to massive importation of slaves from the outside. According to Patrick Manning, Islam, by recognizing and codifying the slavery, seems to have done more to protect and expand slavery than the reverse. The trading of children has been reported in modern Nigeria and Benin. In parts of Ghana, a family may be punished for an offense by having to turn over a virgin female to serve as a sex slave within the offended family. In this instance, the woman does not gain the title or status of wife. In parts of Ghana, Togo, and Benin, shrine slavery persists despite being illegal in Ghana since 1998. In this system of ritual servitude, sometimes called Trakosi in Ghana or Vuduzi in Togo and Benin, young virgin girls are given as slaves to traditional shrines and are used sexually by the priests in addition to providing free labor for the shrine. An article in Middle East Quarterly in 1999 reported that slavery is endemic in Sudan. Estimates of abductions during the Second Sudanese Civil War ranged from 14,000 to 200,000 people. During the Second Sudanese Civil War, as many as 200,000 people may have been taken into slavery. Abductions of Dinka women and children were common. In Mauritania, it is estimated that up to 600,000 men, women, and children, or 20% of the population, are currently enslaved, many of them used as bonded labor. Slavery in Mauritania was criminalized in August 2007. In Niger, slavery is also a common phenomenon. A Nigerian study has found that more than 800,000 people are enslaved, almost 8% of the population. Niger installed an anti-slavery provision in 2003. In a landmark ruling in 2008, the ECOWAS Community Court of Justice declared that the Republic of Niger failed to protect Hadijatu Mani Korau from slavery and awarded Mani approximately $20,000 US in reparations. In April 2014, a group of militants attacked the government girls' secondary school in Chibok, Nigeria. They broke into the school pretending to be guards, telling the girls to get out and come with them. A large number of students were taken away in trucks, possibly into the Kanduga area of the Sambisa forest, where Boko Haram were known to have fortified camps. Houses in Chibok were also burned down in the incident. According to police, approximately 276 children were taken in the attack, of whom 53 had escaped as of 2 May. The students have been forced to convert to Islam and into marriage with members of Boko Haram, sold at a bride price. Records of slavery in ancient Greece go back as far as Mycenaean Greece. It is estimated that in Athens, the majority of citizens owned at least one slave. Most ancient writers considered slavery not only natural but necessary. But some isolated debate began to appear, notably in the Socratic dialogues. The Stoics produced the first condemnation of slavery in recorded history. During the 8th and 7th centuries BC, in the course of the two Messenian Wars, the Spartans reduced an entire population to pseudo-slavery called helatry. According to Herodotus, helots were 7 times as numerous as Spartans. Following several helot revolts around the year 600 BC, the Spartans restructured their city-state along authoritarian lines, for the leaders decided that only by turning their society into an armed camp could they hope to maintain control over the numerically dominant helot population. In some ancient Greek city-states, about 30% of the population consisted of slaves, but paid in slave labor seemed to have been equally important. Romans inherited the institution of slavery from the Greeks and the Phoenicians. As the Roman Republic expanded outward, it enslaved entire populations, thus ensuring an ample supply of laborers to work in Rome's farms, quarries, and households. The people subjected to Roman slavery came from all over Europe and the Mediterranean. Such oppression by an elite minority eventually led to slave revolts. The Third Servile War, led by Spartacus, was the most famous and severe. Greeks, Berbers, Germans, Britons, Slavs, Thracians, Gauls or Celts, Jews, and Arabs were among the many ethnic groups enslaved by the Romans to be used for labor and for amusement. For example, gladiators and sex slaves. If a slave ran away, they were liable to be crucified. The overall impact of slavery on the Italian genetics was insignificant, though, because the slaves were imported in Italy were native Europeans, and very few, if any of them, had extra-European origin. Arising within the context of the Roman Empire with its deeply entrenched slavery, early Christianity accepted it as normal. Peter, considered the first pope by the Roman Catholic Church, urged, "Slaves, be subject to your masters with all reverence, not only to those who are good and equitable, but also to those who are perverse." Today, slavery is less about people literally owning other people, although that still exists, but more about being exploited and completely controlled by someone else, without being able to leave. Modern slavery can affect people of any age, gender, or race. However, most commonly, slavery affects people and communities who are vulnerable to being taken advantage of. It can be someone living in poverty and having no real prospects for a decent job, who will accept a good-sounding offer of a job abroad that turns out to be something else entirely. It can be someone from a community heavily discriminated against, such as Dalits in India, who will have to borrow money for a medical treatment from a wealthy farmer and will fall into debt bondage for decades, with no hope of help from corrupted authorities. Or it might be a young girl who happens to live in a society where early marriage is completely acceptable, who will have no choice over marrying an older man. Or it might be someone who happens to be born to a mother coming from a slave caste, literally owned by their masters from the day they are born. Slavery is also more likely to occur where the rule of law is weaker and corruption is rife. It can also happen to groups of people who are not protected by the law. For example, migrants whose visa status is irregular are easy to blackmail with corruption. Can slavery be abolished once and for all, or is it endemic to human civilization? Let us know in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching Bad Things in History.